Welcome back to It's a Numbers Game podcast. I'm your host, Adam Morris, alongside my co-host, Daniel Welling. And today we're delighted to have Devin Rose joining us again. Devin is VP of Operations at eBridge Marketing Solutions. And Devin previously shared some great insights in episode 63. But today we are talking about perhaps a new and underserved marketing tactic, namely podcast advertising. In this episode, you'll discover why podcast advertising could be a powerful yet underused tactic for MSPs, how to strategically select podcasts to reach your ideal clients effectively, and practical tips on podcast content for wider marketing purposes, including smart repurposing on platforms like YouTube and LinkedIn. So, ladies and gents, we welcome Devin Rose.
Devin, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you guys connecting with me again. Looking forward to talking to you today.
So you very kindly shared some great insights with us last time, and then, blimey, it must be 3 or 4 months since I read a blog on your website about podcast advertising as a tactic for MSPs to employ, which is really interesting and linked to another conversation at the time around MSPs actually producing their own podcast. And really interested to dive into this topic with you today, and then perhaps even more broadly consider what other tactics MSPs are perhaps not commonly using at the moment. So perhaps you could kick us off with just a summary about the podcast advertising topic first of all, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And, podcast advertising is an interesting one because it's relatively new, but at the same time, it kind of harkens back to some old school marketing tactics. Like the most comparable tactic would probably be radio advertising, right? And we kind of saw like a lot of advertisers move away from old school tactics. But I think we're seeing a little bit of a renaissance with those sorts of tactics these days. The reason being is that it's getting harder and harder to measure and attribute success to digital campaigns, mostly because there's increased security tools, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, security and privacy, but like getting attribution metrics from something like Google Analytics just isn't as accurate as it used to be. So if you're doing like some display advertising, let's say, or even Google Ads advertising, it's really difficult to know what's working. And something that what we're seeing with our clients is a lot of even like form fills these days. The vast majority of form fills on MSP websites, they're spam entries, so it throws off your metrics even more. Your Google, dashboard might say you had 50 conversions the past month, but you don't really know how many of those are legitimate unless you were to go through and reconcile with every single individual conversation that resulted from those. So I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of the digital tactics are murky these days, and providing incentive to return to these old school tactics. And I would almost throw podcast advertising in there as well, because if you're doing podcast advertising, someone listens to your ad, it's hard to get like an idea of how effective that is in terms of tying it back to an ROI. And there are some things you can do, like you can, promote let's say a coupon code for, I don't know, your second month free or something like that for an MSP sign up. But realistically, it's more of a brand awareness play, and people aren't going to necessarily convert right away from it. So it is an interesting space, and there's also platforms these days which allow you to buy like a portion of a show's, advertising slots, which is nice because, when podcast advertising first came out, it was kind of all or nothing. You either advertised, you were the primary advertisement for the show or you weren't. And nowadays you can buy just a slice of it and kind of target a certain geography as well. So you could buy, let's say, um, all the impressions for a particular geography where you're operating. So it's an effective brand awareness play for MSPs that way. especially if you can find a show that ties into what your audience is interested in. Obviously, some of the shows might be tied to IT, but given that not all decision makers for MSPs are strictly in the IT realm themselves, generally just whatever would appeal to business decision makers at the clientele you're trying to reach. So yeah, it's interesting. There's a lot of opportunity there. There's obviously a ton of podcasts out there, and there's no shortage of shows to advertise on.
And Devin, then just along this theme, because there are literally millions of podcasts out there, and if you were looking to try and triangulate into what might be the most appropriate podcasts to invest in, this presumably is where sector specialization and niching comes in. So that the tighter the niche, the tighter the podcast fit you can choose for that niche, presumably. I was speaking to someone the other day about private schools. They work purely with private schools, not public schools in any way. So I'm assuming there's some podcasts out there for the private school community. That might be an example of where it makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. And there's a trade-off, right? The more niche the podcast is, obviously, the more the audience is going to be limited to. But for something like, let's say you're an MSP that offers IT for private schools, not example. it- Are you offering IT nationwide, or is it just for your specific geography? Because if the broader that you're looking to target, then, I think the fact that there's a smaller audience matters less. It just is kind of it just opens things up and makes it so there's more decision makers potentially listening to that podcast who you're actually looking to speak to. If you get too narrow in terms of who you're trying to target, then there's just not going to be a sufficient audience. But some other like types of podcasts that, would be appealing to MSPs is some cities, especially larger cities, will have a podcast about new business developments, like new office buildings that are being built in the city, construction projects on the horizon, things like that. That's an interesting one because you can kind of get in the door and set up the IT for those offices, and get awareness of the decision makers in that industry before anyone else can. So that is an attractive one. And also some cities will have podcasts specifically about the IT landscape of that particular city, which is a good option as well.
So many questions. Like, I'm not sure what order to fire these at you in. So tell me a little bit about how you go about identifying these podcasts, and like, is there a marketplace for, I want to target certain region vertical, and you talked about being able to buy advert space.
Yeah, so for the smaller ones, generally speaking, it would be a matter of reaching out directly to the podcast and it being their primary sponsor.
Okay.
I mean, a lot of podcasts don't have sponsors, so you kind of go in there and scoop it up and probably get a relative bargain. I mean, they would be happy with whatever they can get, essentially. But for, medium or larger size podcasts, there's just a ton of different platforms out there these days. I think you can do it even through Spotify, but there's other ones as well out there, numerous platforms that podcasts are on. So it's certainly a space that has, developed over time. And, through those platforms, you can typically select what sort of advertisement you want. Is it one that plays at the beginning of the episode, at the end of the episode, in between? How long is it? Is it your own ad, or is it the host doing a read? I think the best ones are when the host does their own read, personally. It adds a lot of credibility to the advertiser. So that's my preference.
And this will be the point in this episode where Adam edits in our advert. It'll be
Or will it? Or will
Oh,
it?
will
Maybe I'll put it somewhere else just to keep the listeners on their toes. Is there a direct correlation between listener audience size and cost, or is it more complex?
Yes. Yeah, typically. Yeah. So most for the medium and larger size podcasts, the ads are charged on a per thousand downloads basis. It does go back to my point earlier about how some of the metrics are a little bit murky in this space, though, because a thousand downloads doesn't necessarily mean 1,000 listens. Like, for instance, I have my own, podcast app on my phone, and I subscribe to several dozen podcasts. I certainly don't listen to them all. So, there's not the best metrics there, but And then for the smaller ones, it would typically be more of a flat rate that you're paying for. But yeah, it does typically, depend on the size of the audience.
And of course, the free of cash option with some of these podcasts, smaller ones, even maybe some of the medium sized ones, is to actually approach as a guest rather than an advertiser. If you've content that you can offer, value that you can bring to the host of the podcast.
Yeah, for sure. Like the one that comes to mind for me is I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Risky Business podcast. It's a cybersecurity podcast. It's pretty popular, and I listen to it, but a lot of it's just over my head because I'm not the most technical guy. But they have a lot of interesting current events that are happening about things like ransomware and different hacks that are currently ongoing. And their advertisers come on and are guests, but they essentially get grilled by the hosts. The hosts are approaching it from a very critical eye and trying to find almost the flaws in the product or service that's being advertised, which is an interesting approach. But, I'm sure you guys are aware, having, you guys work with a lot of MSPs, and a lot of decision makers in the IT space are very skeptical of advertising. So it's an interesting approach because they're kind of leaning into that and saying, let's come at this from a critical eye, just like our, audience would, and have guests on, but don't necessarily present them in the most favorable light. If anything, they're interrogated a guest. So yeah, there's lots of different approaches, but I think, if you can become a guest on a podcast, that certainly goes a long way.
And you're suggesting that maybe in that case, a podcast aimed at MSPs should generally be that more skeptical edginess, but a podcast perhaps aimed at an MSP's target clients could be different, or indeed advertising might be a more acceptable method.
Yeah, I would say so. I think those involved in the IT industry are a little bit of a unique case, and I've heard it expressed that they're allergic to advertising. I don't think that applies more broadly to like an MSP's customer base. So yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay. I mean, I'm an advertiser's dream, to be honest, because I'm very easily sucked into a promotion or selling a lifestyle. I'm like, yeah, brilliant. Shut up and take my money. but yes, if I was with my MSP hat on, I probably would be, as you say, a little bit more skeptical. So that's quite an interesting point. Adam tends to be our skeptic, so often Adam will throw in a pretty.
It depends how much I like the guest or not, Dan.
Yeah. So you like Devin, right?
Well, he's okay at the moment, but we'll see how things go. We'll come back to the podcast in a minute, but first, I just want to introduce you to the mentoring service from MSP Finance Team. How long will you carry on struggling on your own, juggling cash flow, feeling like you're barely making ends meet, when the very reason you started your MSP was not just to help others master technology, but also to secure your own financial future? Or perhaps you've grown your MSP to a good size and are looking to prepare for an optimal sale or acquisition, but have never done it before. We've walked in your shoes. We're ex-MSP owners and have built our businesses from startup to exit and know exactly how it feels to be constantly firefighting or struggling to grow profit. And that's why our mentoring, or call it coaching if you prefer, exists to help you achieve the rewards you set out to achieve in the first place. More profit, more time, and the freedom to focus on what truly matters. So you're probably asking, why should we work with you? Well, we deliver results. Here are just two examples. A 10 million MSP with a 7-strong leadership team but lackluster results. Within just 2 quarters of working with us, their profits began to climb. At the end of year 1, their profits will have jumped from 300K to 1.3 million. But we're not that big, I hear you say. Well, we work with smaller MSPs as well. A 400K MSP was suffering a 10% loss before we engaged with them and were struggling to move forward for years. Again, within a 12-month period, we've turned that business around. They've got new clients, they've got their mojo back, and they made a 10% profit this year. If you'd like results like this, book a free consultation now at mspfinanceteam.com. And we'll discuss a burning issue that's been holding you back and give you several key actions to take away and implement completely free of charge with no further obligations. Don't settle for less. Make your MSP everything you dreamed it to be. Devin, you were talking earlier briefly about taking that content for the podcast and putting clips on YouTube. So what are some of the other things you can do then about if you are an MSP out there or a vendor out there putting out podcasts like ourselves? How can we exploit the content more and make it work harder for ourselves?
Yeah, so listen, I'll cite the name of your guys' show here. It's a numbers game, and I would encourage anyone who's doing any advertising, or I should say, posting content on YouTube, to go check your metrics for your YouTube videos. And this is a realization that we had for our own YouTube videos recently, where if you look at the metrics, there's a pretty sharp drop off at around 5 to 10 minutes. Even 10 minutes is a bit long. Um, People these days just don't have the attention span and also just the time, right? I think a lot of times people who are going on YouTube, maybe they have 5, 10 minutes between meetings, or, maybe they even just need a little bit of a brain break in between tasks. So you kind of need to cater to that sort of an audience, and it proves out in the numbers. So, I think to whatever degree possible, having options for people is great. It's fine to, record longer form content and post it. That's still valuable. But if you can provide specific clips of that content and post those separately, and make them, I'd say 5 minutes should really be the target, to be honest. That is ideal. Or even just recording shorter form content, that is helpful too. Those are going to be, where you get more engagement. And, we see this trend broadly too, right? Look at the success of like TikTok, for instance, and I'm not suggesting that people start posting 10-second clips in this space, but the general trend towards shorter form video being really popular is something that I think even B2B advertisers can consider when they're doing their own marketing as well.
So, and yeah, we're talking now video, not just audio. Is that what you're saying, Devin? Or are we good still just to do pure audio on these platforms?
I think, yeah, I think it probably applies less so with audio. Because just thinking of my own consumption of podcasts, quite often I put it on and then I have it, going in the background, and maybe I'm, doing something else, doing the dishes, taking the garbage out or whatever. And it's not like I'm so actively watching it. So I think for audio content, it's a little bit more appropriate to have longer form. But for video these days, yeah, I think shorter is definitely better. It's where you're going to see more engagement.
Yeah, I mean, it's spooky actually. I'm just looking at some stats for some video content that I put on YouTube recently, and I think you said 5 minutes, and I'm seeing average viewing duration here. Yeah, 525, 517, which is generally about 30% of the episode length. So, and that's across hundreds, thousands of views. So there's I'd say there's a good sample there. So it's like you're spot on, basically. We should just do everything at 5 minutes on video length. And actually, this video in itself, I'd already broken it down into smaller portions, like multiple parts, to make it easier to consume. So that's interesting you say that.
Yeah, maybe you guys can choose the 5 minutes that makes me look the best. That would be appreciated. And and I would also just say, by the way, that like a nice thing to consider with that insight about the 5 minute videos is it kind of lowers the burden too for how much planning you have to do for a video. So like from an MSP's perspective, like let's say if rather than putting out a video that's an hour long about cybersecurity essentials or something like that, narrow it down. Like talk about phishing, talk about, ransomware, or, incident response planning or whatever, and try to narrow it down to a shorter duration that's on a smaller topic, smaller slice of the whole topic. And that's where you're going to get more engagement.
And so my bright brain has a habit of doing this. So it's gone off and started thinking of counterfactuals to this discussion. And straight away, it's sort of Joe Rogan with his 3-hour podcasts, right? So we've got like, I don't know what his deal was worth with Spotify. Was it 80 million or something like that? So the huge audience. Isn't he the most popular podcaster out there right now? But he's got like really long 3-hour type podcasts, clearly working for that type of content. So what's that saying? Is it saying that there's always exceptions, and it is that, edge of the bell curve type thing, or it's the type of guests he has, or the type of topics? I'm just interested to know, while we're talking, well, it makes perfect sense to me why a 5-minute podcast would be more popular. But we do see these counterexamples of these longer, more in-depth podcasts as well.
Yeah, I think with some of a podcast like Joe Rogan or excuse me, or any of these more generalized podcasts, people are probably listening to them and like in their car, maybe when they're at the gym, when they do have more time to consume a longer form a show. But then if we look at like some same podcasts and what they do on YouTube when they do post shorter clips.
Mm.
And those are
Right.
the clips that, get shared on social media and everything. And those might be the inroads for somebody to find that podcast, subscribe, and then listen to it on a go forward basis. So, I think you can do both.
Mm.
I would say though that if you're trying to target decision makers with your podcast, like business decision makers, these people probably don't have a ton of time. They're busy people. So I'd think a 3-hour podcast, like Joe Rogan's, is probably not feasible. But yeah, certainly you could do a longer form content, whether it's
And
half an hour, and break it down.
and that makes sense. And actually, just thinking about it, these podcasts are often very much around the connection that the listeners have with the host. It's a very strong kind of, maybe celebrity is not the right word, but these are famous people, highly credible people. They have a kind of tribal, component to their followers. So maybe that is a different kind of a different kind of product, essentially, than a business focused podcast.
So certainly from my perspective, I'm a lot more open to producing content that's 5 minutes long rather than 3 hours long. I think that would be a barrier to production, let alone consumption. And I guess one of the critical things you mentioned there was about, these are business decision makers that we're hoping to reach. So that then brings us into something like LinkedIn, for example, and then using those snippets on LinkedIn rather than just on YouTube.
Yeah, for sure. LinkedIn, I have mixed feelings on LinkedIn. And I think most people who go on LinkedIn probably look at their feed and see a lot of fluff. I think that probably goes without saying. There's a lot of things that are just not worthy of a lot of energy or time that are posted on LinkedIn. However, there's no doubt that it is the largest social network used by business people for business purposes. So it's worthwhile being on there. I think if you're going to the effort of recording, webinars or podcasts, of course, it's great to get some additional eyeballs on there. LinkedIn can provide those additional eyeballs, and you may as well post them on your LinkedIn profile. Having said that, I would have kind of lower expectations when it comes to things like having measurable results. It's unlikely that somebody is going to, go on LinkedIn, see your content, and then end up being a customer. But what is more likely, and it's valuable, is if you're an MSP and let's say you get a referral or, someone finds you from word of mouth, they're probably going to Google you. They're probably going to try to check you out and vet you before they reach out. And having content on a platform like LinkedIn that's easy to find is going to add credibility during that process. So it essentially going to increase the conversion rate for the leads that you're already getting, which is valuable in itself. But I would just say that, LinkedIn is unlikely to produce a lot of leads, but so it has a different role than that, but it can still be valuable.
And that kind of takes us into the general conclusion that we often reach when we talk about individual marketing tactics, which is this is a layered concept rather than any one particular tactic. So if you produce content, then it makes sense to release it on multiple channels and then to activate it in different ways. So certainly our own experience recently, we've added an active call-in element to our outreach program, and we find connections between people that have listened to our podcast or met us at an event, and then the phone call is what helps nudge the process along. Whereas if we were just making a call out of the blue and we were unknown and they didn't know us, there'd be no warming up, then the call would almost be far less successful. But equally, if we just post on LinkedIn once a year ago, that's also going to be unsuccessful. But do all of these things regularly and in some form of integration, and is that the only conclusion that we can come to?
I think that's a pretty strong conclusion. I think anyone who's listening to this podcast who's involved in the MSP space probably understands that advertising and marketing in this space is challenging. It's not like consumer marketing where you could just spin up let's say I go back to TikTok, like you could focus on your TikTok and, sell your shoes or whatever your product you're hawking. Like it really is multifaceted. And my advice would be, most MSPs get the majority of their leads from word of mouth and referrals. And I think that the initial kind of marketing priorities for an MSP should be to try to enhance those leads. So, simple things like, especially for one man shows, like one man shops rather, try to get like nice uniforms. Like that's, maybe not traditionally thought of as a marketing expense, but, get some nice, golf shirts that make you look professional. So when you're doing in-person meetings, networking events or whatever that, you come across more credibly, have a half decent website. It doesn't need to be like, earth shattering, but have a website that, puts you forward as an expert, have some content that's specific to the industries that you want to focus on. That's another big thing is, a lot of MSPs when they're starting out take the attitude of, oh, we can offer IT services to any industry, but you should still pick 3 or 4 to focus in on and have content on your website. So when people from those industries land on your website, you come across credibly, and also making sure there's a lot of social proof. So have testimonials on your website, have good Google reviews, have case studies for those particular industries you want to focus in on your website. Like those are the sorts of things that are important. There is no silver bullet when it comes to marketing for MSPs. It's about kind of building up the machinery.
And referral marketing is a core tactic that I truly believe in and try and promote throughout the MSP community. In particular, at least my experience, and I think it's the same with others as well, is there'll be 2 or 3 clients or individuals that work in clients that are top referrers. Or it could be, a partner, an accountant, or a solicitor, or someone like that. But often it's someone who's had a direct experience of the services you provide. And every time they move to another company, they refer that company in. And sometimes they go wider than that because they really like you and they look to refer you to some of their colleagues and referrers and suppliers. And I've had several instances of these examples with our mentoring and coaching clients. And my response to that is, so when was the last time you took them out for dinner? Oh, well, we never do that. Well, hang on a minute. Let me get this straight. So how many clients has this particular individual brought you in the last 5 years? Oh, probably 5 or 6. Right. So they are a major marketing strategy for you. What are you giving them? How are you looking after them? If they're into football, have you bought them tickets, to go and see the football? What is it you can do to truly look after them and kind of care for them and be top of mind with them? Because they're the people that are most likely to continue to refer you. So for me, I think there's a lot to be said around reviewing where all your who your referrers are, go through your whole list of customers, who are the top people there that are referring you, and really think about how you can strategically lubricate that mechanism further and work on really building those strong relationships and take them out for dinner, whatever it is.
Yeah, I would agree. The marketing buzzword is loyalty marketing. And the general best approach for that is to focus on experiences, as you alluded to, things like tickets to events. It- that's going to be more effective than something that is, just like a tangible thing. So that would be something that if you can give that lead that they might then brag about to their friends or that sort of
Or,
thing, that will help even get the word out even
yeah.
more.
Or the example that was given to me, I didn't come up with this, was something that shows you truly know them well or understand them. So not
Yeah.
just like some voucher that you've got off Amazon or something for a meal out somewhere, something that, really kicks in or ties in with some kind of hobby or some passion that they have. Could be sport, could be anything else. So if they're into wine, get them some really good wine or go for a really good wine tasting experience or something like that. Not just something from the local garage. Those kind of things I think that sort of matter a lot more because they can feel that you've gone out of your way here, special efforts being made. And I think those things really matter.
I agree. And another point on that too is a lot of MSPs underestimate how much leads are worth to them. But if you're signing someone up for a 3-year contract and there's monthly recurring revenue and, let's say there's like, 50 people, I mean, in the organization, I mean, that lead is worth like, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Yeah, yeah.
So like make it something good. I had one client who it was a little bit of a different context because he was doing a campaign and to try to attract new referral partners. So it wasn't existing people, but recognizing how much leads were worth, he was considering giving away a car as like a contest. And like, it seems kind of, outlandish maybe, but when you consider the value of the leads that are coming in, it's really not. So yeah, just something to consider is how much are your leads worth.
We've actually done a previous episode on the value lead, and I think we've had a range anywhere between several thousand and tens of thousands of pounds that you would actually pay for a lead. So yeah, you're definitely into car territory at the upper end of the range. And one thing that I was thinking about there, as well as Adam was describing the rewarding of existing referral partners, is generally my own experience, and what I hear most from others, is that it's really difficult to stimulate referrals in the first place from people that haven't referred you before. But if you can identify someone that has referred you before and reward them, they're almost likely to go on and do the same again. So that seems like the stronger of the two tactics.
Yeah, for sure. Farm what's already there versus going outside your ecosystem. Yeah, I think definitely. And then the other thing too is just make sure you follow up with them to let them know how it went.
Yeah, 100%.
So they know that you are, paying good attention to the leads that are being referred and you're treating them well.
Yeah, really good. We've somehow run out of time. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Lots of wisdom, and really appreciate you sharing. So we're at the time for the shameless plug. So if anyone would like to follow up, how best to get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can reach out through our website, which is ebridgemarketingsolution.com. Sorry, ebridgemarketingsolutions.com. The same is for YouTube. If you search for our YouTube channel, that will pop up. We are also very active in the M&A space, which is thehostbroker.com. And yeah, if any of your listeners would like to talk marketing or M&A, please reach out and be happy to have a conversation.
We won't find you on TikTok though?
No, I'm too old for TikTok, I think.
I saw Adam's eyes were sort of rolling and glazing over talking about TikTok. I thought, we've got him on YouTube. That's it. That's a good.
I've only just learned how to text, Dan, to be fair.
Brilliant. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Daniel. Appreciate it.